You're listening to a 58 Ember production.
GIRLSCAMP, it's Girls Camp.
Trigger warning, this episode discusses self-harm and suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation is briefly mentioned around minute 18, and we begin talking more in depth about self-harm and suicidal ideation around minute 52. Take care of yourselves and enjoy the episode. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girls Camp podcast. I'm your host, Haley Rawl, and I am joined today by Alyssa Grenfell, straight from Texas. Enjoying the snow or not so much?
I enjoy looking at the snow. I do not enjoy being in the snow.
Yeah, honestly, amen. I wish I was a Texan right now. Alyssa Grenfell, if you don't know her already, is a content creator and an author. She wrote the book. I'm going to read the title just to make sure I get it exactly right. How to Leave the Mormon Church, an Ex-Mormon's Guide to Rebuilding After Religion. And as that subtitle suggests, a big part of leaving Mormonism is in the rebuilding. I loved your book, and I loved so much how much you talked about rebuilding, rediscovering, okay, what do I believe now? What do I do now? How do I navigate all of this newness? So that is the bulk of what we will be focusing on today. Before we get there, can you give us some context on your Mormon upbringing in a nutshell?
Yeah, I love that recently you said you're kind of shifting, the focus of your podcast. And I think it's a really important shift for so many people because you kind of go through a phase of deconstructing and figuring out how the things that you were taught to believe aren't true and no longer useful. But then also you have to learn to rebuild and make sense of this new life without all these boundaries that were so comfortable.
Yes. And I feel like you did such a good job in your book. I mean, I feel like it's a deconstruction and a reconstruction book simultaneously, which I really loved because I feel like you talked a lot about like, okay, if people are questioning the church, if you find yourself in this boat, but also I would say the focus is, okay, if you're reading this book, you've probably left or maybe will be leaving soon. What's next? And it's very practical, but it also tackles those really big issues of like meaning and existence and identity. And you did it in just such a beautiful way while still tying in a lot of the deconstruction themes. So I feel like this conversation is really perfect for kind of that new direction I'm hoping to go for with Girls Camp.
Amazing. Yeah, I think I have part one of the book is more the initial faith crisis, like how do I even tell my parents this information? And then part two is more how do I order a cup of coffee and what's the difference between an Americano and a latte and a cappuccino because those are completely foreign words.
Yes.
So yeah, I was raised in a very devout family. We didn't even call it a coffee table. We called it a living room table.
You were a living room table family. That says a lot.
Yes. So on vacation, we would still go to church. We'd just visit a random ward. And usually our vacations were to places like Palmyra and Carthage jail. So I was very, very devout. And I've recognized in posting content how often my upbringing was more devout than I think a lot of people's who maybe they had a family that would eat out once a month on Sunday, and in my family that would have been heresy. So I was just, very devout family, baptized at 8, young women's president, Maya Maids Laurel's beehive president, obnoxiously overachieving all the time, and BYU seminary. I had home seminary, so every morning at whatever 5:45.
I still can't believe that. Feels criminal.
In my kitchen of my house being taught by my mom for seminary.
Your mom was your seminary teacher? Oh, wow.
Yeah, in Kentucky. So in Texas, I went to the church building, but in Texas, it was a home program.
Got it.
We had one Mormon neighbor friend who would come and learn, go through the whole seminary manual. And then I served a mission to Denver, Colorado. I got married in a Mormon temple with my husband. So I was a temple worker at the Veil for a while. So I kind of just, you name it that you could have achieved by about 23. I basically had tried to check it off my box.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah.
It's interesting as you were telling that whole story of being so devout. I recently interviewed Rosie Card. I don't know if you know Rosie, but she was similarly like very devout on the scale of devoutness. And it's funny to think about how many people who are very vocal in ex-Mormonism tend to be the ones who were particularly devout while they were Mormon.
Yeah, it feels like manufactured almost by the church, their own demise a little bit, because it's like we gave so much, and so now we're just more indignant at it all versus a kind of casual passive approach to a religion would kind of leave you with like, oh, I stopped attending, and you wouldn't feel this sense of utter loss of identity and family and purpose when you stop believing.
Yes, absolutely. I like the word indignation. It like sets you up to be very frustrated at the very least. And I also think people like you knew your shit in Mormonism, and now you know your shit outside of it. And those personality traits that kind of carry through but manifest in very different ways is always interesting to think about. You grew up in moving around quite a bit. So you just told me this. You lived in...
So born in Provo, South Carolina, till I was probably 2 or 3, Montana till I was like 10 or 11, Texas till I was a sophomore. I finished my sophomore year of high school, and then I graduated from high school in Kentucky.
Got it. How do you feel like the moving around affected your Mormon experience?
Yeah, I feel like, I always felt like I had this kind of built-in friend group, with the church. We'd move, we'd show up on Sunday, and one of the first things we would do would be to meet our new ward. And that was nice in a way because I kind of had this built-in community, but also very isolating because it meant that the only kind of friends I carried from state to state to state were always my member friends because they were the easiest and quickest to make, and the most straightforward friendships that I could have were my people in primary, people in young women's. And so it meant that my closest friendships were always members, even though there were so few members in all of those places. It was just like a plug and play friendship. So I feel like, I think it made it so that my social group was ultra limited, whereas maybe how if I grew up in Utah and anyone in the school could have been my friend, versus my parents kind of being like, you can only sleep over with members and there's only one member who's your age.
Yes. Well, I think about that a lot because Utah is very insular, but the whole state is so insular that I wasn't friends with people in I was to an extent, but they were like my ward friends. And then I had my friends at school. And if you live somewhere kind of against what you might expect, if you live somewhere where there's less Mormons, it almost seems to make the Mormon experience more insular because then you're just increasingly kind of isolating yourself with the other Mormons.
Yeah, and there's more of the outside world that you're exposed to that kind of keeps you more limited from looking outside of yourself. Maybe I would have interacted with more nuanced Mormons if I was raised in Utah, because there's so many types of ways to be Mormon out here. But in a place like Montana, the only people who go to church are the devout ones. There's not this kind of social pressure that keeps a lot of people in. So I think it meant that all of my friends were quite devout. I didn't meet, the nuanced or kind of rule-bending Mormons till I actually went to BYU, which was
funny enough.
Surprising.
Yeah, totally. Where I grew up with kind of the whole spectrum laid out for me. Let's jump ahead to when the first cracks in your faith began to appear and then leading up to you leaving the church. So if someone were to ask you, why did you leave the church? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I think it started most definitively when I was preparing to serve a mission. And I hadn't really done a lot of questioning, I was preparing to serve a mission. So I had this devout childhood. I had many little moments where I'd be frustrated by gender roles in the church. But as far as doubting the belief, the gospel of Jesus Christ, I never had any moments where I was wondering, is this really true? Whenever I was preparing to serve a mission, I was sitting in the temple, and I couldn't serve a mission early on because I had depression, and my bishop said I needed to wait to be cleared by my therapist before I could go, which is wise. I understand that.
And, good on them for that.
Yes, it was really frustrating though, because I felt like, I wanted to go so badly, and I'm waiting for the therapist to say you're good, and I'm sitting in the temple, and I'm feeling frustrated by the limitations of my own, mental health, and feeling like so impatient with God to kind of let me go, So I'm having this internal struggle with wanting to go and not being able to. And as I'm sitting, waiting to do baptisms for the dead, as you do, I had this overpowering feeling that I was going to serve my mission in Italy. And I started to cry, like I actually left before even doing baptisms for the dead because I was overwhelmed by the spirit and emotion, and it felt like God can't give a false revelation in a temple. This is the house of the Lord,
Especially in a temple, yeah.
And so I went home and I wrote in my journal, essentially, I know that I will serve my mission in Italy as sure as I know God lives, and as sure as I know that Jesus Christ is my savior, and, the church is true, basically. And I remember feeling almost like God had blessed me with this special knowledge because I had been sacrificing and waiting to go serve a mission till I was ready for him, ready for the Lord. And so fast forward a few months, I get cleared by my therapist, I put in my papers, I get my mission call. I didn't want to open in front of everyone. I was like, I'm going to, make it special. I hiked up to the Y Mountain and I opened the envelope, and I remember just feeling this like almost sense of smugness of like, I already know what it's going to say.
It's Italy.
Like,
which city though?
Yeah, like I have so much faith, that I don't even need to read this, but it's going to, like, how amazing is it going to be to see that my revelation was true? Mm-hmm. And I begin reading, Sister Grenfell, you're hereby called to serve in the Denver, Colorado mission. And
not even close.
Not even in the same continent.
Yeah, very far away from Italy.
And everyone always asks, like, have you been to Italy? Yes, I've been to Italy. It was amazing. But in the moment, I remember just like looking, like gasping and looking around me and being like, who can I address this issue? Like, this is clear. Can I speak to the manager?
Service?
We're not on the same wavelength.
Wait a second.
And so so by the time I had walked down the mountain, I was fully just like, I had a false revelation. I misread the situation. Like, God can't lie. So I was confused.
It was my fault.
It was my fault for kind of, believing that I could even know this information. And I just buried it so hard because it was so incongruent with my understanding of how God reveals truth to his children that it was like my cognitive dissonance, like, couldn't allow me to kind of continue to think about it too hard or too, like, critically.
Yeah, makes sense.
So I served a mission. I served my whole mission in Denver, Colorado, and I would occasionally think to myself, like, why was that revelation wrong? And I had moments like that too on my mission where we'd pray and my companion would say something like, I just got a revelation. She's going to say yes to the baptismal question. And we'd go and she'd say no.
Yeah. Happens all the time.
It just, these moments kept coming up where someone would like kind of definitively say something and then it just would evaporate. It just wouldn't like be true. And
yeah, I'm thinking about my mission, which is so funny because once I decided to go on a mission, I wanted to go to Germany. My dad served a mission in Germany. I always felt super connected to Germany. I never wrote it down. I should have. Lesson learned. But I got called to Germany. And the reason I bring that up is because the reason I got called to Germany is because I studied German in high school. And even if not that everyone who studies German in high school gets called to Germany, but I'm saying like there are reasons and there happened to be openings in that mission at the time and. And
I think they actually ask where your parents served.
Yes, they do. So that also greatly increased my chances. Doesn't mean that I was, we could get into all of the like, I'm glad I went to Germany. I feel like that was great for my life story and I love Germany. But just peeling back all of those layers and comparing our two stories of having this feeling we're going to go a certain place. And I did get to go to my place and you didn't go to your place, but it was just logistics. It was just that's what happened because someone who was looking at our faces, they needed someone in Denver, Colorado at that specific time. And it's just demystifying all of that and looking back on it and thinking about how, we used to assign, I'm saying we, but I used to assign God was in everything and every detail. But that narrative is being disproven as often as it's being proven, and we're just kind of choosing what we focus on.
It's just chance. So chance, And I also, I had mental health issues, and it's fairly well known that when you have mental health issues, they often don't send you to a foreign mission.
Yes.
Because they don't want to send you far away and then have to have the expense of flying you back home early without you doing all of your paid labor.
Yep.
So it's so I even had somebody once when I told them that story, they explained to me that, I'm surprised you would even think that you would go to a foreign country considering how much you had disclosed to the bishop about your mental health concerns. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of, that was my side of what I should have perceived about my likelihood of going to a foreign mission was just the brass tacks of you probably won't go if you have mental health concerns.
Yeah. But you had your revelation in the temple.
Yeah.
So you go on your mission, you come home, you've kind of been noticing these moments of not always adding up, these revelation things. How does that lead to eventually?
Right. So I had, and then another big one was I received revelation I was going to marry someone on my mission, someone that I had known prior to my mission, and we didn't even date afterwards. So that was another big one of, revelation. I know truth. I know objective fact, and it didn't come to fruition. And
not to make light of all of these, I'm sure that would be devastating, but I wish I had a womp womp. You're wanted to go to Italy, went to Colorado, thought I was going to marry this guy, didn't even date. Yeah, but I think we all relate. I think so many of us have had those really strong impressions that something was going to happen, and then it didn't.
Yeah, and it's always so callously cast aside when you kind of share these experiences with spiritual leaders, he didn't give you that because he's trying to teach you something, or he wanted you to go the wrong way so that you knew it was the right way. And there's no logical way to escape Mormonism because it's always true. So whether it's you got the wrong answer to prove the right answer, or you got the right answer because God is real, there's just no making your way logically out.
No, there's not. I just barely was doing a Patreon episode on the CES letter, and one of the things that Jeremy Reynolds points out, there's literally a quote of Joseph Smith saying, you can get revelation from God, you can also get revelation from your own brain, and you can also get revelation from the devil. And it's okay, well, then what good is revelation, And it's exactly that. Since the founding of the church, they've kind of had these weird, loopholes in logic where you're feeling devastated. I had this feeling that this was going to happen. And it's oh, well, that's just you misunderstood, or all of these things. So you don't even get to feel you're not even allowed to question because of those things.
Yeah. So my biggest shelf breaker, as they say, was when I finally became a teacher, because my dad had given me a blessing that I would become a high school English teacher specifically. And so whenever I got to BYU, I declared my major right away. I had friends who would be I can't really decide. I don't know what I want to do with my life. And I'd just say, I received revelation through a blessing. And that's so definitive that I never questioned, is this good for my temperament? Is this a good, is this something I'm suited for?
Do I want to do?
Do I want to do this? Am I good in front of a large group of people talking for extended periods of, And so I started teaching at American Fork Junior High and quickly realized that I hated it. And not to say, some people aren't really great teachers, and teaching is a very valiant, anyone who's a teacher is doing great things for the world. It just was not for me. And I was having panic attacks, and I even became suicidal at one point, and I was so ashamed to even be in that headspace about a job, which felt so why can't I handle this? A lot of self-deprecation and frustration. And I had this moment where I just realized the reason I'm here, standing in this classroom, having this panic attack, vomiting into the trash can, I'm here because I very faithfully followed a blessing. so just valiantly following revelation from the mouth of God through my dad. And it was awful. And all of these touch points of my mission and the guy I was supposed to marry and all of these revelations that never came true, and sitting and realizing I need to stop assuming I can know the path for my life through the warm, fuzzy feeling that comes in the pit of my stomach and in my heart. That if I just had used half my brain to decide, what should I do with my life? I realized if I was taking accountability for my own decisions instead of looking for an outside source of truth, I actually probably would be making better decisions for myself.
Yeah.
You knew yourself. My revelation.
Yeah. You knew yourself better than the people revealing things or those warm, fuzzy feelings, as you said. And it's so interesting you say that, because you're obviously such an intelligent person. And I don't mean to say people who are faithful are not intelligent, but I have a similar feeling when I look back on a lot of my life path of just being shocked that I didn't even question anything. And not even the doctrine, but the life path that was laid before me. I went on a mission because my patriarchal blessing told me to. It said, you will serve a mission. When I read that, that was as good as scripture to me. So I just went on a mission. I didn't think, do I want to go? Does this make sense with my life path? How is this going to affect my other goals of career, et cetera, et cetera? And it's just interesting how powerful that override is for smart people who are in many other ways very self-aware and very thoughtful. But when you add that layer to it, it kind of just like overrides all of that, which is such a strange thing to start becoming aware of and then like have to make sense of and reconcile.
Yeah. And what's wild is that we perceive that we have such a clear choice in all of it. Like when kids are baptized, they chose to be baptized despite the obvious tremendous amount of pressure from their family and indoctrination they've received even by 8 years old. And I'm sure you got that patriarchal blessing and you chose to follow it though. So it you still have to put the choice on you as a member. Like, but but I did choose to listen to the revelation. So it's my choice. So it's my accountability. So if something goes wrong,
it's on me.
It still was my choice.
Sure.
And it's such a gut punch to be like, it was my choice, but there was only one right choice to make.
Mm-hmm. Well, I even think your breakthrough that you had as a teacher is even steps ahead of what a lot of times that situation can lead to, which is just further self-loathing of, I know still that this is what God wants me to do, but because I'm so miserable, I must be doing something wrong. I must not be faithful enough, or I must have misunderstood, et cetera, et cetera. So I love that at that moment you were able to also push past that layer and say like, actually, no, I think if I listened to myself all along, I probably wouldn't be in this situation to begin with. I imagine the unraveling was pretty intense for you as someone who was so devout and who had done the whole life path thing. If you could speak briefly to, especially in a phase where you were already struggling with your mental health, what was that like to lose your faith?
Yeah, I remember telling my counselor, who was Mormon at the time, I called her for kind of like a emergency call, and I was unraveling a bit at all of this, and I told her, well, I'm hating teaching. I'm having these awful panic attacks. I'm calling into work. I'm laying in bed all the time. And I'm starting also, in addition, to question my faith. And she heavily counseled me to not question my faith, which if you've ever been in therapy, the tone shift from what a therapist is meant to do to like basically telling me something, giving me a very specific objective for, no, you should not do that. That's something that, I think is not sticking, it's not in line with their oath that they take as a therapist. It's not ethical. And that was the last time I ever spoke to her.
Good job.
Which sucks to lose a therapist of 3 or 4 years, but
yeah, absolutely.
So, I think in those first few days, I just had this feeling of almost like disembodiment, that this identity of being a member and being Mormon and being a daughter of God was just ripping itself away from me in this in a way that I felt like I was disembodied. I had like two separate entities that were fighting their way in my brain. And I felt like it was almost like I could physically feel my brain splitting in half to somehow like rip the scales of Mormonism away from myself. And I told my husband. His mom is not a member anymore. She was when she was very young. And so he basically was raised in a part member family. And he was one of those more nuanced members, which I am very grateful for. And he said he wanted to continue to attend. And he basically said, hey, like, you have your path and I support you. I think I'm going to keep attending, but I want you to know if you choose not to go, I love you, which is shocking how rare that is.
Yeah, sad how rare that is, yeah.
You'd think that in familial relationships, whether it's a spouse or a parent to a child or, any of these human relationships that are so close to us, that would be the norm. But most of my friends who have had that experience were threatened with divorce or separation or, just lots of arguing. And so we kind of started on the path of I started on the path of exiting. He was maybe 2 or 3 months behind me, which was really scary, even though for those few months it felt like, how are we going to live in this? We'd always been so close, and suddenly there was just a rift. And that was painful for even a few months. And I can't imagine people who go years that way. But but kind of like while I was kind of logically questioning Mormonism and just the existence of God with all of my experiences. And then he was going and taking a class at BYU about early church history.
Got it.
So it was kind of a tag team.
Yeah, I was going to say yin yang.
Yeah, like we were approaching it from every angle at that point. So he was coming home and sharing stuff about Joseph Smith's polygamy and things that Brigham Young had said and, things about the Book of Abraham, or we basically started diving into the CES letter approach to deconstructing Mormonism together. And I read that whole thing in one day, and late at night, it was probably 3 a.m. that I'm just like manically scrolling through the CES letter and feeling like I've already started to question if God even exists and if he's sending me these spiritual messages through my warm fuzzies. And then now there's all of this. And so I would say the whole process was probably 6 months from that initial, why am I a teacher anyways? How did I get here? To I fully do not believe this is true and I'm ready to try coffee.
Yeah, and kind of move into like the exploration territory.
Yes.
Yeah. Which we are going to talk all about. I want to read this quote from your book because I have a couple questions about it and it stood out to me so much. You say, I like to think the same wild conviction that drove my ancestors to convert to Mormonism and then risk death by crossing to Utah is the same wild conviction that drove me to leave the church. The same recklessness compelled me to write a book that may mean certain family members will never speak to me again. Going against the grain is in my DNA. Fervor and zeal kept my family in the church for over 100 years, and now the same proclivities flow through my veins. Perhaps I'm not so unlike my ancestors after all. I hope if they could see me, they would still be proud. I love the way you compare what you call wild conviction to Mormonism from your ancestors to your own wild conviction now. And I'm curious how making that connection has informed the way you see both your path as a Mormon and your path now that you're on being out of the church.
Yeah, I think there's still that same passion that's definitely there for the desire to stay true to my beliefs. And the beliefs themselves have very much changed, but the conviction and the passion for like living true to that is still the same. And I think that in thinking through, and doing family research into church history, and my first ancestor joined, he was one of the first 200 members to join the church, and I grew up hearing stories about that line of my family all the time, the pioneers, the importance of our pioneer ancestry and how it's kind of in our DNA to be Mormon, and even the belief that I was elect in the pre-earth life. I was so lucky to be born into a family with the truth. And so this all really, inspired my concept of where I came from. And so I think after I left and realized, oh, my ancestors were also murderers. And my ancestors also were kind of sex traffickers of my polygamist female line of all of these women that I can go and find all of the generations that were in polygamy of my direct family. And that is horrifying and not something that I'm obviously proud of. And I feel a lot of sadness for both the violence that my ancestors likely waged against Native Americans specifically, the belief of women being secondary, and that, you know, all of the violence against women that happened in polygamous relationships and the kind of entrapment of that, and the racism. You know, I mean, look at the history. There's so many objectionable things to point out, but I do think what I can reclaim from all of that is my wild conviction. And I think that being able to say, well, I'm going to keep this part of it all is a way that I can still say, you know, I'm not proud of necessarily what a lot of my ancestors did, but I am proud that I can use that conviction to kind of assist other people now in raising my voice and saying, hey, here's some things I learned about this that I think everyone should know.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating simultaneous continuation and also complete subversion of like legacy. And it is such a weird thing to think through, which is why I love that quote, because I think about this a lot of like, yeah, we obviously, I mean, I believe in like ancestral trauma and also just like obviously genetically, like we're connected to the people who came before us. And I love how you summed it up, because I think you can on one hand hold, as you said, like that was not right, that was very wrong, but also understand that you can now do better and do different with that wild conviction that you pointed out. And I also think not to justify at all any of those things that you mentioned, but you think about like women ancestors, Mormon women ancestors, and how I guess I would just like to think that had they the same information that I had now, and had they the same access and resources that I had now, they would be doing what I'm doing. And they just lived in a different time and in a different place. And again, not justifying bad things that were done and that happened, but thinking like, oh, maybe were they here in this time and place, would be doing something more similar to what I'm doing than still going to church, you know?
Yeah. And I also think it's kind of beautiful to look back at the long history of women speaking out against the church, like with Fawn Brody, or I love Sandra Tanner. There's all these women. There's a book I just got. I don't remember her name, but she wrote the book Wife Number 19. She escaped being married to Brigham Young and got a book published. And, you know, there is a long history of women trying to raise the alarm bells and raise the flags to say, hey, this is a dangerous and damaging religion specifically to women.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I think that I think even when I read my own family history, it's just kind of a lot of poor, ignorant farmers. It's, you know, there's the leadership of the church, there's the viciousness of Brigham Young, there's the callousness and kind of charisma of Joseph Smith and the lying that he did. But then there's a lot of kind of innocent, naive people who followed blindly and with hope and with faith.
Yeah, and just kind of got caught up in it all. And I mean, you think about what we were talking about with our upbringings, like I was very caught up in it until I was kind of ready not to be anymore. And it's sad. It's sad that that's the thing that they got caught up in, you know, and that there were people who were like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young that were kind of preying on those vulnerabilities and that ignorance. And I think it's something really worth thinking about. I appreciated that portion of your book, and I appreciate you talking to it, because it's not like that just disappears when you are no longer Mormon. I want to ask what you believe now. And I know, because you wrote about it in your book, you consider yourself an optimistic nihilist, at least at the time of writing your book. Can you explain what that term means and kind of talk about what that means to you personally?
Yeah, I think I no longer identify very closely with any descriptors. I use them because they're helpful, But I feel like when I said I was Mormon, what that meant was my entire being and identity are Mormon. I am a Mormon. And I, now it's kind of like these words like atheist or agnostic or optimistic nihilist, these are helpful for people to understand in short, kind of what I believe or where I'm coming from, but not something that I would vehemently defend and shout from the rooftops and obsessively pursue, hoping that everyone can come to the same conclusion as me. And I think that's important to note too, that since leaving, there's not really ever, I don't think, going to be any belief system or identifier that I hold to myself in the same way I did Mormonism. I do think I think I'm still an optimistic nihilist. I think I think my favorite way of summing that up is that nothing matters, but nothing matters. And that means you actually now have the freedom to kind of play in the sandbox for yourself for the first time and make your own meaning and say, well, my family is what matters to me, and that is the core of my belief system is just me and my family. And, that might not be the case for everyone. Not everyone has kids or has a spouse. And so I wouldn't try to evangelize for my meaning that I've made for everyone, but that's because it's my meaning. And I think the permission that I've found in making my own meaning as kind of an optimist that I think when we die, we just die and we're just in the ground, and that's scary to a lot of people, but to me, it's very enriching to feel kind of the permission to say, well, this is all I have, so I'm really going to make the most of it. And so yeah, that's how I would define that. But sometimes people will be like, you need to read 1,000 books so that you can describe exactly what optimistic nihilism means from every single philosopher's perspective. I'm like, it's just not like that for me anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I was thinking that same thing as I was reading your book. You have a really good chapter on this, on like kind of all the places that one can land when they leave Mormonism. And I do want to talk more about why you feel like you landed in optimistic nihilism. But I was thinking the same thing. I have been kind of trying out secular humanism on for size. There's a lot about secular humanism that really resonates with me. But do I know all that much about it? Not really, and maybe there will be a time, and maybe with the new direction of this podcast, like I'll really dive into that, but not because I want to like know every in and out of like, okay, what is the most prominent secular humanist saying about XYZ thing? Because that doesn't really matter to me. It is nice to kind of be able to have like a shorthand when someone is like, what do you believe? That comes up sometimes, especially talking about what we talk about on the internet. But I feel the same way where I'm like, yeah, there's a lot about secular humanism that I relate to. There's a lot about optimistic nihilism I relate to. There's a lot of overlap between a lot of these things. Sometimes I'm like, maybe I'm kind of agnostic. I don't know. And it's really nice to free yourself from the need to label, but yet still the external forces that be want you to have a label, because that's how we make sense of people. And especially around beliefs, as people who grew up labeling by beliefs so heavily, I even have found myself like, if I meet someone and then I find out they're a Christian, it like means a lot to me in a way that I don't want it to. Does that make sense? Like, and I mean, that's a whole can of worms that we don't necessarily need to get into. But I guess I'm trying to say like, that maybe just doesn't matter as much as I grew up believing it was like the ultimate thing that mattered to not only identify someone, but to know if that person was safe or if that person was moral, et cetera, et cetera. And so I really like what you said about like, yeah, this is kind of the bucket that I best fall into, but it's just ultimately a bucket. And how can one person's whole experience and beliefs and thoughts and opinions fit into one particular bucket? They just can't.
Yeah, and I feel like I would maybe, if this is not the best analogy, but it's almost like I feel like Mormonism was my entire being. It was my head to my toes. It was my soul. It was my heart. It was literally my everything of me was a member of that church. And I think now beliefs are more like clothing I try on. Like, oh, this jacket is helpful for this weather, or right now I'm at the beach, so I'm going to wear this bathing suit. So it's more like, I think maybe as a member, I felt like my beliefs have to be black and white, and I have to have them in their entirety, and I should know every single thing about every single prophet, what they said in every single general conference. And now it's more like I want to utilize ideas to be helpful to me in my life. And so when I kind of come across an idea and hold it in my hands, I say, is this helpful? What weather should I wear this in? Or maybe I don't like that outfit at all. And it's just not who I am as much as something that I can use depending on the situation.
Yes. And something that you are expecting to evolve.
Yeah.
As I think things should.
Or donate to Goodwill.
Yeah, exactly. And be like, actually gonna try something else. And I think that that's having the freedom, again, to change and change even really deep beliefs, which feels like that's something I think I felt pressure around, is like, well, fuck, like if I say I don't believe in God, then like I don't believe in God. I can't come back 5 years from now and say I believe in God. Yes, I can. Why not? I totally can. I can do whatever I want to. And I think having that freedom is really, really good for the human psyche, as well as you're just kind of like going through life and things change and experiences come up. And it just doesn't make sense that you would think the same thing all the time. I've been thinking about this around politics, and you actually have a chapter in your book where you talk about politics, because I do think, as you point out, that those things are very related, right? Like our beliefs connect to our values and morals, connect to our politics. I've been thinking about how that kind of thinking of I'm a Mormon can also, I found myself politically feeling a little bit that way, of like I have to wear this whole identity. Mm-hmm. And I've never really crystallized it until you were saying that, but I'm just thinking about the fact that even in politics, like things are really nuanced and complicated, and you don't have to fit in one bucket of I'm a liberal and therefore this, and this, and this, and this, and this, right? Mm-hmm. And just having the freedom to do what you just said with your beliefs, I think can also apply in like politics and in all these other facets of life in ways that are really hard, because my brain isn't used to that.
Yeah, I the two examples I use in the book are one where I feel like my opinion is very cut and dry, and one where I have a more nuanced political opinion. The first is gay marriage, which to me I feel is very cut and dry. I believe full, I 100% can fully say I believe all gay people should be able to get married. Full stop. And not because they can, not because of, I go through kind of arguments against gay marriage, one of which, well, they can't have kids, or, well, straight people don't always have kids either. So, kind of breaking down, I kind of go through the structure of common reasons people say gay people shouldn't be able to get married, and writing out my response and my position. And that's kind of one example. The other example is abortion, which I shared, there was a woman who had, I think she was maybe 35 plus weeks pregnant, and she had on her belly still not a human. And you can find that image pretty easily. And I felt like seeing that, that gave me a lot of like what you're describing, which is I am a feminist. I believe in, abortion access. And I feel like but then I also feel this sense that there's a difference between an abortion in the first 12 weeks versus an abortion at 35 plus weeks. And I kind of wrestle with that in the book, trying to say, where do I feel the line should be? There's also exceptions for the life of the mother. There's exceptions for incest and rape. And it's like you said, it is really complicated. And also the comfortability of saying, I don't actually have to explain my beliefs to anyone. And my beliefs don't have to fall in line with, a Democratic Party platform, or my liberal friends, my progressive liberal friends, or my conservative family. I actually do get to have my own position on this. And sure, if people could argue with me about it, but actually I have the autonomy to have my own kind of position. And that is something we're all, I think as members or even ex-members, we really want to conform. We love the feeling, the safety of conformity. It feels so kind of everything we were brought up to feel comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And that's also just a human trait. So it's just a human trait supersized by being raised in Mormonism. And so even when we leave, we might just retrofit that same desire for acceptance onto some new thing, whether it's
some new identity,
being a Swiftie or being how you view yourself politically. And it feels like unless I rigidly believe in every single thing that is part of this kind of system of belief, I am an outsider, and I don't like that.
Yep. Well, I feel like politics, I've been feeling like the cult trigger, as I call it, of like, oh, I'm seeing a lot of the same thought patterns that I deconstructed in leaving Mormonism coming out in these really intense ways in the political sphere or as people commentate on politics. And to your point, a lot of things are very cut and dry. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not saying like there's nuance to just like objectively hateful policies and things and some things that we're seeing right now. But I also am recognizing, some of this trigger response that I'm even feeling in myself feels like it's kind of hearkening back to that, like, you have to belong in this specific thing or that thing will kick you out, Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad we could pause on that for a minute because I think it's very relevant right now. And I think that, this is not a hot take by any means, but we need more discourse where you're able to say, yeah, seeing that 35-week pregnant baby be called not a human, I actually don't agree with that. Though I am pretty strongly pro-choice, like without the people being like, because they will. Like, I hear it in my head already. Right. So I think that that's a really relevant thing and something really important to think about as you're moving beyond Mormonism of like how you engage in community and in the world. As far as I understand nihilism, and like I said, I've kind of been like dabbling in this space myself, and especially optimistic nihilism, is you kind of get the freedom to assign your own meaning. There's a line in your book where you say, you are the god of your own world. So, as god of your own world, where do you find meaning, or how have you gone about like assigning new meaning and new purpose?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, and it's funny because I feel like this is a topic that I don't talk about as often, purely because I feel like and I'm happy to, I'm happy to talk about it in the sense of what I'll share. But I also feel like one of my new meanings is privacy. That is one of my new values, is not having my kids on the internet, photos of them or talking about them a lot or using their names, not sharing a lot of, pictures of me running my half marathon or, having certain parts of myself that are just for me and just for my family. And especially as I've had a larger following on the internet, I've felt that even more strongly, that I need to keep certain parts of myself just for me, and they don't belong to anyone else. And so a lot of my meaning now is I love running. I love spending time with my family. It's funny to have so many members who make comments like, oh, our life is meaningless now. And I'm like, if you saw me at the park with my kids, I would look like just like any other person to you. But it's never a good idea to try to prove your value to someone who's making comments like that.
Great point. Lost cause anyway.
Lost cause. So I live, outside of posting videos on the internet, I live what I would consider to be a really just normal, boring life. I have a drink every once in a while, not even every night. I saw another comment that was like, I can just picture Jackson and Alyssa, having drug-fueled, LSD tripping, weed smoking, drinking till 4 a.m. conversations, and their life is empty. And it's funny to have someone describe that when you got up at 4 a.m. to change a diaper. And,
Yep, and just like live again, just like not a life all that different probably from the life you lived as a Mormon woman, like, yeah. I mean, at least for me, there's some huge differences, obviously. But as far as like my day-to-day experience of like working and being a mom, I mean, I guess I have an ex-Mormon podcast, but replace that with a different subject. It's kind of like pretty similar, at least for me. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think so. I think the meaning, and I spend a lot of time just like making meals for my family, making breakfast. We go to the children's museum. It's all so boring but beautiful. And I think the reason I sometimes just say I'm not gonna bring that to the forefront, is to just also say that part of me feeling safe in all of this is to only share this side of my world with people who I know really care about me. I have like a private Instagram with 18 people on it. And those are the people, you know, I used to have an Instagram a long time ago where I'd post a picture of like, you know, me and my family, and it would be, you know, 500 people viewed it and 4 people liked it. Mm-hmm. And I want the 4 people in my life now. Mm-hmm. I think I've moved past this kind of past people having passive viewership of my most sacred, special moments, and said, I just want, you know, the people who deserve to be let in, that's who I'll let in. And everyone else can see, you know, the parts of them I choose to share, like all of my stories about leaving the church, which was 8 years ago, so it feels very distant emotionally in many ways. But the stuff that is kind of currently very special and very just for me, it's I've learned through process of failure and, you know, what's the word? Like
trial and error.
Yes, I've learned through trial and error that I need to just have the people closest to me that I've shared my most vulnerable parts of myself with. And that is something that's really important to me.
Yeah. I'm very curious to see privacy as like even a currency in our society probably increase, especially with the rise of social media and with influencers and micro influencers and just so much of our lives being displayed and performed even online. And that's still a fairly new thing, relatively speaking, like in the grand scheme of things. And I think it's doing really probably detrimental things to our brains and to our mental health. And I hope that will be more of a pull for more people and kind of become hopefully more the norm as people see, to your point, like just casting everything in front of an audience is oftentimes like really detrimental to mental health. I really appreciate your thoughts on that because I feel like that is a line that I'm very much practicing and discovering, especially as someone who holds such a high value on, I hate to use this word, it's such a like buzzword, but vulnerability, for lack of a better word, and has found so much power in connecting with other people, oftentimes online, through their vulnerability. It's a really fine line to walk, and there's a lot to consider. And I think that's really cool that you have just been able to identify, like, no, for me and my life, like privacy is a really high value, and it seems like it's serving you really well. You talk in the book a lot about your mental health and how you struggled with severe depression growing up, using self-harm sometimes as a coping mechanism. Where is your mental health at now, and how has it been affected by like leaving the church? Has there been healing in that arena, or just if you could speak more to the mental health stuff?
The first time I saw a counselor was probably when I was maybe 12. After I think I started, you know, self-harm, specifically cutting, maybe like 10. So very early, you know, that's very early on. And I kind of hid it from my family, from my parents for a couple years. And then finally I just, you know, couldn't hold it in anymore. And that's when I started seeing a therapist for the first time. And that pattern of kind of depression and self-harm was huge, you know, probably through when I left the church. It was really scary, really bad, I felt a lot of guilt. I think a lot of the messaging about the atonement when you're in that kind of a mindset is really damaging, because when I hurt myself, I'm actually hurting God and Jesus had to experience, you know, the belief in Mormonism is Jesus experiences everything we experience. So if I do that to myself, I'm actually doing that to Jesus.
Yeah, and the physical pain of it is very emphasized in the atonement. Like Jesus physically felt pain and bled from every pore. I can imagine that would be very triggering. Yeah,
so a lot of, you know, if I think back to a lot of my thoughts around it in that time, it was so much exacerbated by guilt from what it meant according to my religion to feel this way, and a lot of self-hate and a lot of inability to forgive myself. And I'd take the sacrament and then I'd do it again, and I'd have a meltdown of just hating myself, you know. Why can't I just get better? Why can't I use the atonement to heal myself? And I think a lot of the language I hear used about being gay is how I felt about feeling broken and feeling like praying for God to take it away from me and apologizing for my sins. You know, I think I, in many ways, viewed self-harm as a sin that I was committing. That was a big part of not being able to go on a mission, you know, telling my bishop that and working with the counselor. And during my mission, I was okay. I would just sit in a really, really hot shower instead of self-harming, because it was like, not that, I mean, it basically was another version of that, but it felt like that was permissible.
Yeah, easier to get away with.
Yeah,
maybe.
like it wasn't like I was physically hurting myself. I was just scalding myself with water, which was kind of a way to bridge the gap of how I was previously using a coping mechanism. So, you know, it wasn't gone, but I feel like I was kind of rigidly keeping a better handle on it because I wanted so badly to stay on my mission. And then when I got back, it was my parents were going through a divorce, and that made it bad. So it's a long,
Yeah.
you know, I think I always thought it was just going to be something I was doing for a few years. And then it was like, I've done this for 20 years, you know. And after I left, after I left the church, I went from, you know, probably self-harming and having really bad depression and suicidality like once a month, self-harm maybe every other week, and in the worst times like every day, to like once a year. And, you know, now as I you know, last time I experienced that, last time I self-harmed was like 2 years ago, which is a long time.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
when you're having this like ultra severe mental health issue that's impacting you every single day, day after day after day, going from doing that every day to then it's been 2 years is amazing.
That's amazing. Thanks for your transparency on that, because I feel like that's just not something, I don't know. I kind of have this thing with like depression, anxiety, where it's like, it's a great thing that we're all comfortable now saying that we're depressed. I mean, it's not great. We're all depressed, but a lot of us are, and we can talk about it. I talk about being medicated all the time, but having severe depression is a really dark experience. And I kind of have found myself feeling like, yeah, like I'll talk about depression, I'll talk about anxiety, but it's like, it's not just like, yeah, depression, anxiety, like it's really dark, you know, and self-harm can come up. Like there's so many things, suicidality can come up. And I just think transparency is really valuable around that, because I think, I don't know, sometimes I'll see people be like, yeah, I have depression. And I'm like, okay, but like that I do too, but it seems like you're fine, you know. And this is also, I mean, kind of going back to privacy, and like, obviously I'm not saying everyone needs to share these things necessarily, but I do think that transparency is really valuable, because certainly you're not the only person who experiences that. And I think, you know, I can relate, though not with self-harm specifically, but I can definitely relate. And so I think that it's a powerful thing, and it's also so exciting to think about how you've healed from that in a huge way. What do you think contributed to your healing and being where you're at now?
Yeah, I think to some extent, and I also have gone through medication, Wellbutrin, and I have an anxiety medication, and I took one this morning. I actually don't take the antidepressant anymore, and I haven't for about a year and a half, which is cool to not need it.
Yeah,
I do still take
awesome.
the anti-anxiety. I took one this morning.
What do you take?
I take,
you don't have to just. I just like swapping. I'm always like, it's always just funny to me. But
you know, I still get nervous to like do interviews. I don't get as nervous when I'm just me on camera, but doing interviews, I'm like, oh,
totally different thing.
I texted Haley last night, like, if you want to cancel, we can.
I knew you were feeling it. I should have just said, I was like, oh, I think it's the nerves kicking in, because I'll do the same where I'm like, oh, I just don't want to do it. Yeah, I can also very much relate.
And you were like, no, we should. And I was like, she's right, we should.
You're like, okay, fine, I'll do it.
And I'm glad you were like, oh, I'm excited, because I'm excited too, you know. But it is, I think maybe the reason also sharing about my mental health is not one of my, this needs to be private categories. And I think for some people it is. And I think since Mormonism was 8 years ago, my mental health stuff was even longer ago. And the worst was 15 years ago, you know. And I think I have it on the list of things that no longer feel like personally very weighty. As I consider kind of what has gotten better, I think having my husband in my life made a huge difference. He's seen me in very bad shape, specifically with self-harm. I think he's saved my life in, like, I'm not having any hyperbole when I say that. So I think that he's been very kind of stalwart, to use a Mormon word, to just be by my side. And, whenever I'm kind of having crisis moments, to say, what are we going to do? He has my therapist number 2. He's had conversations, she's in the other room. How do I help her right now? What do I take her? So it's interesting to me, and that's why I dedicated my book to him, was because it's so interesting to have someone tell you what Christ-like love is your whole life, and then to experience love, which is what I have felt with my husband. And realize, I think that's also kind of almost what was kicking off my faith crisis a little too, was realizing I'm being told that God loves me, and he has put me in the situation where I am hating my life and suicidal because I'm a teacher, and that's from God. And then I'm also experiencing my husband's love, which is infinitely different than what I've been taught to believe is true Christ-like love at the hands of my church and my gospel. And so I think he's made a huge difference in just having, one person in my life that really, truly just loves me.
That's really, really beautiful. It's also beautifully ironic that when you came to him, I'm thinking about when you came to him, and even though he was still wanting to attend church, and you said, I don't know if I, even believe God is real. And his first response was love. And that's like the ultimate Christ-like love, but offered to you when you were saying, like, I don't even think I believe in Christ anymore. And I think that that's really beautiful and also really relatable. Like, when you find love outside of that framework. And I was actually thinking about this. I don't know why I was thinking about this morning, but I was thinking about, I feel really fortunate because I feel like my mom, though very Mormon, and though I was raised very Mormon, that's the kind of love that I feel like I was offered in my leaving of the church, was kind of like, it's a bummer. It's not that it's not awkward and uncomfortable at times, but it just didn't really affect her love for me. And again, absolutely devastating that needs to be like something unique for like a mom to a daughter.
Celebrated, yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's really sad. But so much of why I'm fueled to do what I do and talking about all of this is because not everybody gets that. Some people don't get that from anyone in their life when their faith changes. And that's just really devastating. But it's really beautiful that you had that in your husband, and he sounds awesome.
Yeah, I remembered what I was going to say earlier, because I think a reason that it's important to me to be transparent about mental health and even be as specific as something like self-harm is I know that as a kid, if I would have seen myself on the internet, not about the Mormon stuff, but just if I interface with someone successful, air quotes successful, I can like where I am now, I see myself like I would have considered myself successful as long as I wasn't talking about this, but that's another viewpoint. But if I came across someone successful, I would have never in 100 million years would have thought that they would have gone through anything like this.
Yep.
And been able to kind of work their way out of it. I believed I was just fundamentally broken and that nothing was ever going to really ever get better. And so I think that's another reason I think it's so important for me to talk about my mental health, was because I know that seeing me on a screen probably looks like I've never had anything ever wrong with my life.
Yep.
And knowing that it very much was is a way, I think, for people who are currently in the throes of depression or other difficulties in their life to be able to say, wow, okay, if she did it, maybe it can get better.
Yes, and that we're not all so different after all, that probably anybody you see in any successful capacity has those stories and has those things about themselves. And a lot of people, not because it's a bad thing, but a lot of people don't want to share that, and that's fine. But I do think that is why it's so powerful to share that, is because we're all again, cheesy and cliche, but so much closer than we think, I think, on things like that. And that brokenness is actually really relatable. And it's what makes us human. And knowing that these people that we maybe look up to in certain ways also have waded through similar brokenness is really powerful. Thank you for sharing all of that. Truly, I really, really am just so honored to be able to hear your story. And I think you're doing such amazing work. I want to transition just here at the end and ask a couple of questions about what you do on the internet, because you are fucking crushing it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like with the size of your audience and the content I see, the comments I see, it feels like you are mostly reaching like a never Mormon audience. You're doing a lot of education for people who aren't Mormon but are very interested in Mormonism. Would you say that's right? I mean, I'm sure you have tons of like ex-religious people as well, but it seems like just with the size of your audience and some of the content that you put out there, it's more like teaching people about Mormonism who don't know.
Yes. I think the interesting thing about teaching about the history of Mormonism is that you often can hit all three camps of the Mormons who've never heard it, the ex-Mormons who need to feel vindicated, and the never Mormons who are just curious and are like, what is this thing to begin with?
Like what?
So you kind of, in some of my definitions of like, this is the history, like my video today was the Book of Abraham. A lot of this stuff is stuff I never knew that Joseph Smith claimed that the mummies that he bought off the traveling salesman were the bodies of the pharaoh. I just never heard that before. So even for me, I think a lot of the content does end up reaching a very broad audience of a whole, people all across the world. But I think the kind of magic of Mormonism, or it's darker than that.
It's magic in a way, though. Yeah. Like the lore is really interesting. It really is.
Yeah. The sleight of hand that Mormonism does means that members don't know basic facts. Ex-members really enjoy even relearning basic facts because, wow, I feel like, and a lot of my comments of ex-members are people who are saying, I'm so grateful for not feeling crazy that I left to know this information because my family, whatever, makes me feel like I'm an idiot, I'm a black sheep, I'm an apostate for choosing to leave. So hearing this voice is kind of helping me feel less like a crazy person. And then the final is just curious people who watch Secret Lives of Mormon Wives or American Primeval, and they're like, so what is Mormonism?
Yeah, what's going on? It's a great point because I learn new stuff from your videos all the time. And I feel I'm not like the most well-versed by any means in like Mormon history stuff specifically, but there's just always more to learn when it comes to Mormonism. I am curious what it's like, speaking to the Never Mormon portion of your audience specifically. What is it like getting feedback from Never Mormons when you talk about Mormonism? And has that affected your own perception of your journey in Mormonism?
Yeah, I've realized that I think that as far as ex-Mormons go, just like there's lots of different types of Mormons, there's a lot of different types of ex-Mormons. And some people, when they leave the church, I think, and I'm going to say at the outset, I think all of them are valid ways to leave. So the way I did it is just the way I prefer to do it. Not that it's better for anyone listening, but I was the type of ex-Mormon that as soon as I lost my faith, I hightailed it out of Utah. I never want to live in Utah ever again. I took my name off the rolls almost immediately, years ago, nothing to do with my kind of internet presence now. Like this was years ago. I wanted to sever every bond I had made and burn almost most of the bridges and just say, I want the opposite. And some people, when they leave, want to still occasionally attend and maybe they'll go to see their friends, then they'll stop wearing garments, but they like going to some church activities. And some people just are like, oh, I just live in Utah and I don't even notice kind of the Mormon context. Whereas when I'm here, it feels very large to me. I think a lot of people leave and they're kind of like, oh yeah, that was a few years ago. I'm kind of over it. And it's not this big thing for them. And so I think that in leaving when I did, which was around 23, 24, I kind of supersized jumped into never Mormon territory. Moved to New York, where most people I met never even heard of Mormons. And so most of my kind of post-Mormon, after-Mormon, ex-Mormon experience has been interacting and sharing stories with people who were never Mormon. And so I think a lot of sharing my experience is often how I felt in the bar the first time when I went out with coworkers in New York and they're circled around me and I start explaining to one person, this is like the third beer I've ever had. And yeah, I used to wear garments and I did this chanting thing. And, I went on a family vacation to Carthage jail and got excited about bullet holes and doors. And slowly as I'm talking, like one after the other of like a group of 15, everyone's just like, what is she talking about? Is she talking about leaving a cult right now? And like realizing maybe the power of the ex-Mormon experience of how many people are just like, that's happening in my country almost in modern.
And you just seem normal. Like you don't seem like, you know what I'm saying? Like I think people think people who left a cult like are going to look like they did. So I think it's surprising to people that that's just like there's people around them that are probably ex-Mormon because it is so crazy.
Yeah, and maybe if I had stayed in Utah, I would maybe be the fish in water where you can't even articulate like the water because you're in it. And so maybe leaving New York and then moving to Texas, I've just had so many more experiences of explaining to outsiders what the church is and seeing how many times, sometimes when I'm talking to like a coworker or a friend, I've had people turn around and ask me, what are you talking about? Because they're so enthralled with what it is that, and most people too have met missionaries knocking on their door. They've seen a big temple. They have some occasion to brush up against the church. There's a lot of curiosity about it, and there's really not a lot of people who will kind of unabashedly tell everything.
Yeah, I feel like that's something that you do. And even as someone, I talk about this stuff on the internet as well. That was like a really cool kind of self-aware moment for me too. Just thinking about, I know that I'm still very steeped in it because I live in Utah, because I'm around my family all the time, very believing. But even being in Utah, I get invited to events now. And it's like a lot of the women there are Mormon. And a lot of the women there know who I am. And they know that I talk about ex-Mormonism. And the reason I bring that up is because being where I am, talking about ex-Mormonism and being like pretty consistently perceived by active Mormons, and not only perceived by, but needing in some way to like assimilate and not be just like, I can't walk into like, yeah, I guess I could. But you see what I'm saying? And like, I have realized in some ways, I'm glad for it. And in a lot of ways, it is still kind of a thing that I think holds me back in ways I don't realize. Because until you're talking to a never Mormon, you're never going to get even ex-Mormons. And that's another really interesting thing. I'm around ex-Mormons all the time, but most ex-Mormons, especially in Utah, are still very connected to Mormon family, to these same kind of Mormon ties that I'm talking about. And I have really admired your content because you just are like very straightforward, very to your point. Like you're going to tell everything you want to tell, which I think is so powerful and so important. I still feel some limitations myself around that. And it's also, there's lots of things this could be chalked up to, but I do just think it's particularly interesting to think about the environment and how much that affects that. And also just how validating it is and how important I think it is for ex-Mormons, regardless. And it's not feasible for everyone to like move, but to expose yourself to never Mormonism in that way, because it sheds light on the craziness of it all in a way that even ex-Mormons, I don't think can
kind of comprehend. Yeah. And I wouldn't call it, I feel like, I love listening to Girls Camp, I'll say. It's not, I don't know. And I personally wouldn't describe it as a limitation, though I totally honor your decision to use that word. I actually think it's a bravery. It's the ability to have both worlds in your head all the time as an ex-member in Utah who's public is actually really brave.
Thanks.
And having the nuance of kind of knowing you're going to see members and have friends that are members and have friends that are ex-members. There's just a level of sensitivity that I think is the reason a lot of people love your content so much, because I don't bring that sensitivity, which for some people is like, hell yeah, I don't want sensitivity. I want brutality. Tell me like it is. But a lot of people, when they're leaving, especially, you're not really looking for brutality.
Yeah.
You're looking for a soft place to land.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why I love there are so many Mormon voices. I love, that there's podcasts that just delve into the history, because some people just need the history. Some people need, a campfire. Some people need someone who's talking more openly about whatever the temple or whatever, So I think it's kind of a tapestry of resources.
Yeah.
And I probably wouldn't have been ready for my own content till I had been out of the church for a few years. And so some people who reach out to me are in the midst of their faith transition, and they're like, hey, yours, this is my content. But then a lot of people, I think, are like, I'm binging girls camp. A lot of people are binging RFM. I think it's really beautiful that as kind of post-ex, whatever you want to call us, Mormons, we are kind of offering many different ways to grieve Mormonism.
Yeah, I really love that, because I was even thinking, I did a temple episode and I talked about it on my podcast, and then I was like, if you want to see more of this, go check out Alyssa Grenfell. And it's just really nice too that like there can be a full picture made with all these various personalities and various backgrounds too. Like, you and I have very similar but also very different backgrounds, and so it's really a cool thing that there is all of that tapestry, like you said. I think you put it perfectly. And thank you for those kind words. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on Girls Camp. It has been a long time coming, and I'm so happy that we made this work. And I just feel really touched and inspired by your book and by your story and getting to talk to you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I will make sure to link all the things so people know where to find you on all the socials. I'll link the book and everything. So go get more Alyssa. People will be wanting more, I'm sure. And thank you, everyone, so much for listening. Bye.
GIRLSCAMP, it's Girls Camp.
This has been a 58 Ember production. For more shows, please visit the 58 Ember channel, 58ember.com, or find us at 58 Ember Media on socials.